It wasn't the rehearsal itself that stunned palace staff, it was what happened when it stopped. One exchange, one prolonged silence, and Princess Anne reportedly stood, gathered her papers, and walked out without explanation. Courtiers dismissed it as scheduling friction. But inside royal circles, whispers spread that this wasn't about logistics at all, it was about who still held influence inside the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. According to various reports and interpretations circulating among royal commentators, the closed-door rehearsal had originally been expected to pass without incident. It was not a state ceremony, not a coronation, not a constitutional crisis. At least, not officially. Instead, it was understood to be preparation connected to an upcoming major royal appearance, one of those carefully managed occasions where every detail, every position, every entry, INCE and exit becomes part of a larger institutional message. Inside royal life, rehearsals are rarely just rehearsals. They are exercises in order, continuity, and sometimes quiet power. Princess Anne reportedly arrived the way she has long been known to arrive: prepared, precise, and unwilling to entertain unnecessary improvisation. Royal observers have often described Anne as someone who treats ceremonial duty less as performance and more as obligation. Reports suggest folders had been circulated beforehand, schedules finalized, positions agreed upon. To many in attendance, the expectation was simple: refine the details, confirm timing, move forward. But insiders whisper that the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. According to Palace Watch speculation and competing interpretations of events, Queen Camilla introduced proposed ceremonial adjustments later than some participants had expected. No official account exists confirming what those changes involved, yet reports suggest they may have touched questions of presentation, placement, and symbolic emphasis during the appearance itself. Small changes on paper, larger implications in practice. Inside institutions built on tradition, even minor alterations can carry extraordinary meaning. At first, those present reportedly expected discussion, clarification, the normal give and take of planning. Instead, several accounts suggest the room became unusually restrained. Conversations slowed, responses shortened, long pauses appeared between remarks. Observers later claimed something felt different. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Just measured exchanges and carefully chosen words. Princess Anne, according to multiple interpretations shared by royal commentators, reportedly returned repeatedly to established arrangements and precedent. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was said to advocate for flexibility and presentation adjustments consistent with evolving public expectations. Neither position appeared unreasonably, emerged in isolation. But together, insiders suggest they represented something larger. One side emphasizing continuity, the other emphasizing adaptation. And suddenly, a rehearsal stopped feeling like a rehearsal. Staff members reportedly became unusually quiet. Administrative aides avoided entering and leaving unnecessarily. Several participants were said to exchange restrained glances rather than comments. The silence itself began attracting attention. Then came the moment people would later discuss. Accounts differ on timing and detail, but multiple retellings describe Princess Anne eventually closing her documents, standing without visible frustration, gathering her materials, and leaving the room. No announcement, no visible display, no explanation. That absence of explanation may have become the loudest detail of all, because those familiar with Anne's public reputation often describe her as someone who rarely signals displeasure theatrically. If she disagrees, she works. If she objects, she continues. Which made the reported departure feel unusual enough to generate immediate speculation among observers. Courtiers reportedly moved quickly to reduce attention. Scheduling differences, routine adjustments, nothing unusual. And yet, according to media insiders and palace commentary, people kept returning to the same question. If nothing happened, why did the room reportedly feel so unsettled afterward? The answer, some suggest, had very little to do with ceremonial timing and much more to do with influence, authority, and where the balance inside the modern monarchy may now truly sit. Because if the rehearsal revealed anything at all, it may not have been disagreement, it may have exposed a quieter struggle already underway beneath polished appearances and public unity. But the rehearsal dispute was only the visible moment, because insiders suggest disagreement had been building for weeks. For years, They represented two entirely different visions of royal life, one built upon annihilation on discipline, the other on adaptation. And according to palace observers, those worlds may finally have collided. If the reported rehearsal departure raised questions, what followed only deepened them. Because once the initial explanations began circulating, timing issues, ordinary scheduling friction, routine adjustments, another interpretation quietly emerged beneath the surface. Some observers began suggesting that what had unfolded behind closed doors was not an isolated disagreement at all. Instead, they argued, it reflected something far older and far more difficult to manage inside any monarchy. The tension between preserving tradition and redefining it. Princess Anne has long occupied a particular place in public understanding of the royal institution. Commentators frequently describe her as steady, exacting, and deeply protective of continuity. Not necessarily because she seeks attention, but because she rarely appears interested in it. Over decades, her reputation has become attached to reliability rather than reinvention. Duty first, interpretation later. According to royal observers, Anne's approach has always carried an underlying assumption that institutions survive not because individuals reshape them at will, but because each generation protects the framework it inherits. Queen Camilla, however, is often interpreted through a different lens. Over time, palace commentators have suggested that her influence operates less through formal structures and more through relationships, adaptability, and private diplomacy. Rather than emphasizing rigid ceremony, reports often describe an approach focused on accessibility, practicality, and navigating changing expectations around modern royal life. Neither philosophy exists outside royal history, and perhaps that is exactly why moments like the rehearsal began attracting attention. Because when two approaches to influence coexist under pressure, even ordinary decisions start carrying extraordinary weight. San emerged, dares whisper that this contrast had become increasingly noticeable during recent transition years. The monarchy, according to many interpretations, has been balancing multiple expectations at once: continuity without stagnation, modernization without disruption, stability without appearing immovable. Under conditions like those, ceremonial details stop being details: where someone stands, who enters first, what language is adjusted, which traditions remain untouched. Each decision becomes open to interpretation. Reports suggest that over recent months, different advisory voices may also have gained greater visibility around senior figures. No official confirmation supports claims of competing camps, but Royal Watch circles increasingly discussed what they described as differing schools of thought developing behind palace walls. One emphasizing institutional discipline, the other emphasizing evolution. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly confrontational, yet enough, some suggest, to create beneath public unity. According to several commentators, this is why the reported rehearsal disagreement resonated more widely than people expected. It wasn't simply about revised arrangements or changing ceremonial preferences. It became symbolic of who guides the tone of the institution, symbolic of which instincts matter most during uncertain periods, symbolic of whether adaptation strengthens continuity or slowly replaces it. And once people began interpreting events through that lens, even silence started acquiring meaning. Royal reporting soon shifted tone. Questions changed. Observers stopped asking what happened inside the room and started asking why moments like this seemed increasingly noticeable now. Why during a period already defined by transition? Why during a time when every appearance feels more scrutinized? Why did a rehearsal suddenly feel larger than the event itself? No one offered clear answers. But according to insiders and competing palace and actions, the conversation had already moved beyond logistics. Because if the rehearsal represented a symbolic clash rather than an operational disagreement, then attention naturally turned toward what exactly had triggered it. And then came the detail that transformed private tension into public speculation. People didn't remember words, they remembered reactions. And according to those watching closely, Anne's expression said more than any official statement ever could. By the time discussion around the rehearsal began spreading beyond private circles, the details themselves had already become strangely difficult to pin down. No official account emerged, no clarification appeared, no statement was issued acknowledging disagreement, disruption, or anything remotely unusual. And yet, according to observers and media commentary, that silence seemed to create even more attention rather than less. Because people stopped searching for what was said. They started examining what happened immediately afterward. According to various interpretations circulating among Royal Watch communities, the sequence itself became the story. Not dramatic, not explosive, quiet, controlled, almost too controlled. Reports suggest the meeting ended differently from what some attendees expected. Movements inside the schedule reportedly shifted. Staff who had anticipated follow-up planning instead found themselves adjusting timelines. Administrative routines appeared unusually compressed. Nothing extraordinary in isolation. But taken together, observers began describing the atmosphere as oddly unsettled. Several commentators later suggested that what captured attention was not confrontation but restraint. People remembered pauses. People remembered interruptions that never became arguments. People remembered departures. And most of all, they remembered reactions. According to accounts repeated across commentary circles, Princess Anne's reported departure remained difficult to interpret precisely. Masasai Mabia, it appeared measured rather than emotional. No visible frustration, no public dissatisfaction, no attempt to explain, which created a paradox. If someone leaves dramatically, the story becomes obvious. If someone leaves quietly, everyone starts asking what wasn't being said. Insiders whisper that after Anne exited, the room reportedly continued, but not in quite the same way. Staff movement allegedly became more cautious. Conversations shortened. Participants focused on practical completion rather than open discussion. Again, none of this has been confirmed publicly, but absence became fuel. And in royal life, absence often carries unusual weight. Media commentary soon followed a familiar pattern. Individual details that seemed meaningless alone began connecting into larger interpretations. Commentary pieces revisited previous appearances. Analysts referenced earlier moments of visible distance between senior figures. Casual observations were reframed into possible patterns. Manashed, suddenly ordinary moments acquired retrospective significance. Had there been earlier signs? Were ceremonial adjustments becoming more visible? Were different voices carrying different priorities behind palace doors? And perhaps most importantly, who ultimately decides? That question appeared repeatedly across commentary. Not because observers believed authority had changed overnight, but because moments like this invite larger speculation about influence. Royal institutions operate publicly through continuity and privately through relationships, schedules, and trust. According to palace commentators, those structures become especially sensitive during periods of transition, when expectations evolve faster than traditions. So when a rehearsal reportedly creates questions, people rarely believe the rehearsal itself matters. They assume something underneath it matters. That assumption only intensified as official channels remained unchanged. No denial, no acknowledgement, no explanation. I see just business continuing exactly as planned, which, to some observers, felt less like closure and more like containment. And once that interpretation took hold, the conversation shifted again. It stopped being about whether Princess Anne agreed with ceremonial changes. It stopped being about whether Queen Camilla supported a different approach. Instead, speculation turned towards something larger and more difficult to answer. Was this moment revealing competing visions or simply exposing pressures that had always existed beneath the surface? Because if reactions revealed more than words, then perhaps the rehearsal itself had never been the real story. But this wasn't simply about one event, it touched a much older royal question. Inside royal life, rehearsals are rarely just rehearsals. Every position, every entrance, every gesture can signal something much larger. That may sound exaggerated from the outside. After all, a rehearsal is supposed to be practical, timing, coordination, or I, but inside institutions built on continuity and symbolism, ordinary procedures often carry extraordinary meaning. According to royal historians and longtime observers, ceremonies are never simply about appearances, they communicate structure. They tell the public who represents permanence, who carries responsibility, and how authority quietly moves from one era into the next, which is why moments of friction, even reported ones, attract so much attention. Because when people begin debating rehearsal decisions, they are rarely debating rehearsal decisions. They are debating interpretation. For decades, Princess Anne has occupied a unique position inside public understanding of the monarchy. She is often portrayed not as the loudest royal or the most publicly celebrated, but as something many commentators consider equally important: predictable. consistent, resistant to unnecessary reinvention. Her reputation was not built through grand declarations. It emerged through repetition. Owing up, following through, continuing regardless of changing headlines. That public image matters. Not because it grants authority in a formal sense, but because institutions often rely on figures who symbolize continuity during uncertain periods. And uncertainty changes everything. According to Palace commentary, transition years inside a monarchy create unusual pressure. Expectations rise. Interpretations multiply. Every decision becomes easier to question because people begin looking for signs of future direction in present moments. That is where symbolism becomes powerful. A seating adjustment can become a story. A revised schedule becomes a message. A delayed appearance becomes a theory. And a rehearsal becomes something larger than preparation. Observers frequently suggest that influence inside royal life is rarely communicated directly. Public disagreement is uncommon. Major declarations are rare. Instead, influence appears in subtler forms whose recommendations are accepted, whose traditions remain untouched, whose priorities shape outcomes. People notice patterns. They notice who adjusts. They notice who doesn't, which may explain why interpretations of the reported rehearsal spread so quickly. To some commentators, Princess Anne's reported response represented commitment to preserving continuity, a belief that institutions maintain trust by remaining recognizable even while circumstances evolve. To others, that interpretation felt incomplete. Another perspective emerged. Some argued adaptation is not opposition to tradition but necessary for survival. That flexibility protects institutions from becoming disconnected. That modernization and loyalty are not enemies. And suddenly a private rehearsal reportedly became attached to a much larger question. What does loyalty actually look like during change? Is it preserving established practice exactly as inherited, or is it protecting the institution by allowing it to evolve? Neither answer appeared simple. When Princess Anne emerged, complexity made the speculation stronger rather than weaker. Because once competing interpretations took hold, people stopped focusing on personalities. The conversation became philosophical. Observers began describing two visions of service emerging not as rivals necessarily, but as different responses to the same challenge. Preserve, adapt, hold, adjust, continue, change. And perhaps that is why no public explanation ever seemed fully satisfying. Because if the disagreement people imagined was never truly personal, then it became harder to dismiss. What if the rehearsal mattered precisely because nothing dramatic happened? What if restraint itself revealed the pressure underneath? And what if the reactions afterward carried more meaning than the rehearsal ever could? If the rehearsal exposed differences, the next developments only deepened them. No denial, no confirmation, just silence. And in royal storytelling, silence often becomes its own headline. If observers expected clarity, after the rehearsal speculation intensified, they found the opposite. The days that followed appeared almost deliberately ordinary. Public schedules continued. Engagements remained unchanged. Official updates maintained their usual rhythm. No visible disruption emerged. No acknowledgement suggested anything unusual had occurred. And yet, according to commentators and Royal Watch circles, that normality did not calm discussion. It accelerated it. Because within institutions built on continuity, silence is rarely interpreted as emptiness. People search inside it. They study what was not said. They compare appearances, timing, and language. They begin looking for meaning in routine itself. Reports suggest that palace communications followed familiar practice: keep focus on duty, avoid feeding speculation, continue operations as scheduled. A strategy that has often worked. But this time, some observers argued, the absence of explanation became part of the story. Different interpretations questioned. Monarchy emerged. One group of commentators dismissed the entire narrative as projection. According to that view, routine scheduling disagreements happen constantly behind the scenes and only become headlines because public fascination turns ordinary moments into symbols. From this perspective, silence meant exactly what silence usually means: nothing required explanation. Others disagreed. Some royal correspondents suggested that the lack of comment reflected something more strategic, not concealment, not confirmation, simply institutional instinct. The monarchy rarely explains internal process because explanation itself creates precedent. Address one report, and 10 more follow. Then another interpretation appeared, a quieter one, Observers began suggesting that the issue no longer mattered because of what happened inside the room, but because of what people believed the room represented. That shift changed everything. Discussion moved away from personalities. Less focus on whether I.C. proven. Less focus on whether Camilla proposed changes. Instead, the conversation widened into questions about stability. What reassures people during periods of transition? What signals continuity? Who becomes associated with preserving confidence? According to royal commentary, institutions become most vulnerable not during open conflict, but during uncertainty. When no clear explanation exists, interpretation rushes in to fill the space. Public reaction reflected that divide. Some viewed the reported silence as evidence of professionalism, a refusal to turn private matters into public theater. Others viewed it as distance. Still others treated it as proof of larger tensions that had existed quietly for years. No single narrative dominated, and perhaps that was the point. Because once competing explanations become equally believable, the tension itself becomes the story. Commentators revisited older assumptions. Analysts compared leadership styles. Casual discussions evolved into broad. When dawn emerged, the debates about adaptation, hierarchy, and public trust, the rehearsal had become background. The meaning assigned to it became foreground. And something else happened too. Attention started drifting away from official statements altogether. People began examining individual responses instead. Not what institutions communicated. What individuals communicated. Who appeared unchanged. Who remained quiet. Who continued exactly as before. And among all those questions, one figure increasingly returned to the center of discussion. Because if silence had become the headline, then people wanted to understand who inside that silence appeared most comfortable carrying it. And that's when attention turned back to Anne. Walking out may not have been dramatic, it may have been deliberate. By the time attention returned to Princess Anne, the conversation had changed shape. The reported rehearsal itself no longer dominated discussion. Instead, people began focusing on something harder to measure and, easier to project onto, response, or more precisely, the absence of one. Because for observers who have followed royal life for years, Anne's public identity has never been built around reaction. It has been built around restraint. Commentators often describe her as someone who rarely explains herself publicly and even more rarely performs emotion for an audience. Throughout decades of changing headlines and shifting public moods, her reputation has remained unusually consistent not because she speaks often, but because she usually doesn't, which created an interesting contradiction. The less she appeared to respond, the more people wanted to interpret what her silence meant. Reports and commentary began revisiting older moments from royal history, not controversies necessarily, but periods where meaning was communicated indirectly. Moments where attendance mattered, timing mattered, presence mattered, or absence mattered. Royal institutions, according to longtime observers, rarely audit through open declarations. Signals tend to arrive in quieter forms. A schedule maintained, a schedule altered, an appearance shortened, an appearance unchanged, nothing announced, everything noticed. Against that backdrop, interpretations of Anne's reported departure started evolving. At first, some treated it as frustration. Later, others suggested something different. What if leaving was not rejection? What if it was simply closure, a decision to stop discussing and continue elsewhere? That possibility shifted the tone of the conversation. Because if restraint becomes intentional, then silence stops looking passive. It starts looking controlled. According to Palace Watch commentary, the days afterward only added to that interpretation. Public appearances continued. Scheduled obligations reportedly moved forward without visible disruption. There were no gestures toward controversy, no visible attempts to redirect attention, just continuation. And strangely, continuation became, its own statement. Observers began analyzing ordinary moments with unusual intensity. Routine appearances were discussed as if they contained hidden messages. Neutral expressions became interpreted. Familiar patterns suddenly seemed meaningful. Some commentators pushed back against that entirely. They argued the opposite, that reading significance into professionalism misunderstands royal life altogether. That continuing normally is exactly what duty requires and should not automatically be interpreted as coded communication. Others remained unconvinced, because they argued that continuity itself can communicate confidence. And confidence, especially during uncertain periods, sends its own message. Soon the debate became less about Anne and more about what people expect from public figures under pressure. Should leadership reassure through explanation or through consistency? Should restraint be understood as strength or as distance? There was no agreement, only competing interpretatio, menace layered onto ordinary events. Yet through all of it, one detail remained difficult for observers to ignore. Nothing publicly changed. No narrative was corrected. No larger explanation arrived. And because nothing moved outwardly, attention kept drifting inward, toward intention, toward meaning, toward the possibility that perhaps the most significant moments inside institutions are not the ones that create noise, but the ones that continue quietly afterward, as if nothing happened at all. Yet observers kept asking the same question. What happens next? Every modern monarchy survives by managing tension without appearing divided. That may be the quiet contradiction at the center of this entire story. Because by the time observers finished debating the reported rehearsal, interpreting silence, and assigning meaning to ordinary moments, a broader realization began to take shape. Whether anything significant happened behind closed doors almost became secondary. The larger question was what? Her institutions built on continuity can absorb pressure without allowing the pressure itself to become visible. That challenge is not new. Royal institutions have always existed in a difficult space between symbolism and reality. They are expected to feel permanent while adapting to changing expectations. They must appear unified while containing different personalities, different instincts, and different ideas about what service should look like. And perhaps nowhere does that become more visible than during periods of transition. According to commentators, public expectations placed on senior royals are unusually contradictory. People expect decisiveness but not conflict, leadership but not dominance, change but not disruption. The result is that every action becomes interpreted through two separate lenses: what happened and what people believe happened. That distinction matters. Because once a story enters public conversation, it often stops belonging entirely to events themselves. Monarchy reports become narratives, narratives become symbols, symbols become assumptions, and assumptions can start carrying more weight than facts. This is where media attention complicates everything. Commentary thrives on interpretation. Patterns are connected, timelines are compared, individual moments become chapters in larger stories, a rehearsal becomes a referendum, silence becomes strategy, routine becomes meaning, yet institutional reality is often less dramatic than public imagination allows. That tension creates its own cycle. The public searches for signals. Institutions respond with continuity. The absence of response becomes another signal, and the cycle continues. Observers began pointing out that maintaining public unity may not mean eliminating differences at all. It may simply mean ensuring differences never become the dominant story. That interpretation reframed the reported rehearsal entirely. Maybe the significance was never disagreement. Maybe it was containment, because I asked if competing approaches truly exist inside modern institutions as preservation and adaptation, often do then the real measure of stability becomes whether those differences remain manageable. Not invisible, manageable. That distinction changed the conversation again. People stopped asking who won. They started asking what success even looks like. Is success complete agreement, or is success continuing forward despite disagreement? According to many royal commentators, continuity has always been the priority. Schedules continue. Appearances proceed. Responsibilities remain unchanged. Not because tension disappears, because continuity itself becomes reassurance. That does not mean symbolic moments lose importance. If anything, symbolic moments become more important. A delayed entrance, an unchanged schedule, a routine appearance, a quiet departure. None of these necessarily prove anything, but they invite interpretation because people instinctively understand that institutions communicate through symbols long before they communicate through explanation. Which may explain why this reported rehearsal remained difficult to forget, not because it changed anything publicly, but because it reminded people how much meaning can be attached to moments that officially mean nothing at all. And perhaps that's the real meaning behind the rehearsal story. Maybe nothing historic happened in that room, or maybe history inside palaces never announces itself, it simply begins with someone standing up and leaving. And perhaps that is why this story lingered longer than anyone expected. Not because there was confirmation, not because there was evidence of some dramatic confrontation hidden behind palace walls, but because moments like this invite something larger than certainty. They invite interpretation. And once interpretation enters royal storytelling, ordinary events begin carrying unusual weight. When this began, attention centered on a reported rehearsal and a reported departure. When people searched for details, they wanted timelines, explanations, conclusions. They wanted a clear answer to a simple question: what happened? But as the conversation unfolded, the question slowly changed. People stopped asking what happened. They started asking what it meant. Because inside institutions shaped by continuity, meaning often becomes more influential than the event itself. A rehearsal becomes symbolic. Silence becomes intentional. Routine becomes reassurance. And departures become stories. Looking back across everything that followed, the commentary, the speculation, the competing interpretations, it becomes difficult to ignore how little actually changed publicly. Schedules reportedly continued. Responsibilities remained. Public appearances moved forward. No visible rupture appeared. Yet something still captured attention. Maybe it was because people sensed pressure underneath the surface. Not personal pressure, institutional pressure. The pressure to preserve confidence while adapting to changing expectations. The pressure to remain familiar while moving into a different era. The pressure placed on individuals expected to represent stability regardless of private disagreement or competing priorities. That pressure does not create villains and heroes. It creates interpretation. Some observers saw the reported rehearsal story as evidence that tradition still commands quiet authority. Others interpreted it as proof that institutions inevitably evolve through negotiation and adjustment. Some believed silence reflected confidence. Others believed silence reflected caution. And perhaps all of those interpretations reveal something not necessarily about the people involved, but about the expectations surrounding them. Because royal life has always existed in a strange space where ordinary moments absorb extraordinary meaning. People rarely remember schedules. They remember symbolism. They rarely remember explanations. They remember pauses. And they rarely remember exactly what was said. They remember who stayed, who left, who continued. Which brings the story back to where it began. A room, a rehearsal, documents gathered, conversations left unfinished, no statement, no conclusion, only a moment that some dismissed immediately and others treated as symbolic of something larger. Maybe it was routine, maybe it reflected nothing at all, or maybe, as royal history so often suggests, the moments that seem smallest at the time become meaningful only afterward, not because they changed outcomes, but because they revealed the pressure behind maintaining them. And in the end, perhaps the real lesson was never about disagreement. Perhaps it was about continuity. About institutions moving forward even when questions remain unanswered. About duty continuing whether interpretations are right or wrong. And about the uncomfortable truth that uncertainty itself sometimes becomes part of the story. Because long after speculation fades and attention moves elsewhere, on Suher, one image remains. Not conflict, not resolution, but an empty rehearsal room and questions nobody officially asked. Sometimes the loudest moment in royal life isn't an argument, it's the silence that follows. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.